Hi, this is Geert-Jan from the NetBeans team. In this screencast I want to show how to create a Java EE6 application using Maven as the build system and PrimeFaces for the visual layer with NetBeans IDE as the tool. What we'll be doing is displaying the data that you can see here in this panel in the bottom right from a Derby database. So this is one of the test databases that comes with NetBeans. Displaying that in a PrimeFaces based application deployed to Glassfish. So here I have the Glassfish server already running. To get started, create a new Maven web application, and I'll call it Hello PrimeFaces. Click Next, choose the server, choose our Java EE version, click Finish. And we have a Maven application, which we can see from the fact that we have a POM.xml file. In our POM.xml file we can see we have right now one dependency set on Java EE, and we can see that dependency right there, Java EE6. In the source packages we have one package, and we have a JSP page which we can immediately remove since we will not be using JSP but facelets. Let's do that. I go to the Properties window, to the Frameworks panel, and I add a new framework. I say Java Server Faces. I can choose which version of JSF I want to use. Right now there's only one available anyway. And I can also see that I can choose to use JSP if I want to, but Facelets is the modern way to do it, giving you templating and CSS in particular. And there are various component libraries supported, and the one that we will use here is PrimeFaces. We click OK, various files are added, notably an index.xhtml file, which is a standard facelets file, and you can see that when we look inside the web XML file that not only is the facelets servlet registered, but also we have this index.xhtml file as the first page we will see set as the welcome file. In the index.xhtml file we can see that there is a link to the welcome PrimeFaces file, and this is a PrimeFaces laid out file. So in other words, a facelets file using the PrimeFaces component library. That's all well and good, so let's deploy the application. And what we see is our index.html page with a link to our PrimeFaces page, and look at that, we have a wonderful start to our application. A header, a footer, a big space where we can do something to display customers or provide some welcome text, and a list of links, and this is provided by a PrimeFaces component. A great way to get started, so let's continue and include our customers in the main part of the application. What we want to achieve is that the data that you can see in NetBeans IDE, the data that I showed earlier on, that this data is displayed inside of this space. So we actually are pulling data from the database following the guidelines and specifications provided by Java EE6 into our PrimeFaces application. To get started, we actually need to get hold of this data and represent it in some way inside of our application following Java EE6, and the way that that is done is via the JPA specification, Java Persistence Annotations. We find that there is a template called entity classes from database, and for each of the tables that are in our database we can choose the ones that we want to use in our application, which tables we want to use. I will choose the customer table, which has foreign key relationships with two other tables, so these are also automatically included. Click Next and specify a package where for each table we have selected a Java class will be created. Following the JPA specification there will be one so-called entity class for each of our tables, and via these entity classes our lower level data will be accessed. You can also see that if our data actually changes, we can go back into this wizard and switch from new to a different setting, update or change, so that we can override the classes that we are now creating when our database changes. We click next. You can see that we can specify what kind of collections are used, for example, whether fully qualified table names are used, so we can really customize what is going to be generated. Click Finish, and for each of our tables we now have, thanks to NetBeans, an entity class. So here are these entity classes. So you can see here customer class, customer table, discount code table, micromarket, and here is the micromarket table. Look, for example, inside the customer class, and we see the annotations that are part of the JPA specification. So there is @entity, making this an entity class, and here there is a link, a mapping from this class to the table named customer. And then we have several so-called named queries, which are also part of the JPA specification, mapping the SQL query to a more readable, more usable format. So instead of saying the whole SQL query, we can say instead customer.findAll or customer.find by customer ID, and that will represent the underlying SQL query. Moving down, we can see also that there are annotations for validating the columns in the table. In other words, if in the case of the name column, the user of the application were to enter more than 30 characters, an error would be displayed to the user. Pattern matching is also supported. So in the case of a phone number, for example, NetBeans suggests a pattern that should be matched inside the field that the user will be typing in when entering data back into the database, which should match, and if not, that data will not be entered into the database. All kinds of different validation checks can be set, in other words. For the rest, this is a plain old Java object with getters and setters, and right at the end the equals and the toString. This is the same for the other two Java classes as well. These are plain old Java objects, standard domain objects or business objects, annotated with special JPA annotations and bean validation annotations. In addition, there is a very important file that's been created, the persistence.xml file, which we can open here, and we can see here an XML file that controls these three classes. You can see here that the XML file includes all entity classes that are found inside of this module or inside of this application. The convenient thing about JPA for tooling purposes is that it's very easy to identify for NetBeans which of the classes are actually entity classes because they are marked with the entity annotation. So everything inside the application that has the entity annotation is by default accessible via this XML class, and later on we're going to be able to access these three classes and the underlying data by referring to this XML class. Here's the source of it, very small XML file providing access to the underlying data. So to prove that, let's quickly create a servlet. And the servlet is going to test our database connection. So we're going to just verify JPA servlet. And this is just going to be to check before we start working on our visual layer or on a controller layer that we have a good connection that's working the way we want. We could register this in the old way inside the web XML file, but we will not do so because in the new way in Java EE 6 we instead use an annotation. Right now we can run this servlet. So I right click and I choose run file, and we run the servlet. Let's wait a second. Okay, here it goes. Servlet is deployed, and we should see it. Yes. Okay, so there's the message, and message comes from here. So let's change to something different. So this is a servlet for verifying our JPA connection. Verify JPA. Save it, and the nice thing in NetBeans is as soon as you've saved a file in your web application, it's redeployed, the whole application, and here you can see verify JPA. Okay, now we want to access our data from our servlet as a quick check before continuing and getting into deeper waters. I press Alt Insert and I say use Entity Manager, and the Entity Manager is a Java E6 class for referring to the underlying XML file. So you can see here the persistence.xml file has this lengthy name, and inside of our servlet we refer to that lengthy name. So here is the persistence name of that XML file, and we now have some Java code, as you can see here, Entity Manager, which refers in here in the code to this XML file. Right, persistence/logical name is suggested as a name, and we can use it here. So we can now call from inside of our servlet to this persist method to potentially at a future stage in our application persist our changes. Right now we will not do so. All that we're actually interested in is getting the Entity Manager. So we don't need to persist anything. So we just say get Entity Manager, and no transaction needs to begin. All we want to do is return the Entity Manager. Now that we have access to the Entity Manager, we can use it in our code. So I'm going to say here get Entity Manager, which again in other words means get hold of the XML file which redirects to the underlying Java classes, create named query, and between the quotes I can use my named queries, which is really convenient. So one of these, in one of those three classes, was customer.findAll, and once we have that we can say get the result list. What's interesting is that when I hold down the control key and move my mouse over the named query, I can see the underlying SQL query. So this named query represents that SQL query, and we get back from the SQL query a result list. What I can also do is I can click on this once I see this hyperlink and jump into the underlying customer class, and I'll do so and then go into the toString to make this toString a bit more interesting. Right now it's a bit of garbage, so instead I'll have a name and I will have a city. Okay, now let's refresh this page, and here we see our data. At this point we have a test servlet which accesses the underlying JPA layer, the underlying database layer, and we can proceed to the layer above this, which is the layer providing the controller classes, in other words the session beans. Next we are going to now add our controller layer. We have checked our data layer, it's working, so let's move on to the next layer in our three-tiered application, and provided by our session bean. Here is a session bean. We'll call it customer session bean, put it into a package called beans. There it is. And what we want to do with this particular session bean is the same thing that we were doing in the servlet. We're going to move the code from our servlet into our session bean. Here you can see we have a get entity manager. Instead of doing it in a session in the servlet, we're going to do it inside of the session bean. So there it is. And that's all we need. The fact that this Pojo has an annotation stateless is all that's needed to make this plain old Java object a session bean. Here we go. So I press Alt Insert, And now I'll add a new method which will return a list of customers. So here we say get customers, and our return type is list customer. Delete all of this. Okay, what we're doing is formalizing what we were testing in the servlet and moving it directly into our application. Get entity manager, create named query as before, customer find all, and get the result list. What we could also do right now is test whether this bean is working correctly. Before we tested whether the JPA layer was working correctly. Now we will do a quick check and create another servlet, verify bean servlet. Again, we will use annotations, so no registration in the web XML file is needed. Here in this servlet we're going to say, we will not say use entity manager because the bean is using the entity manager. Instead we're going to call the bean. Here's the bean, call it, there it is. We're injecting the session bean into our servlet, and now we can directly refer to that session bean, which makes our code really nice and neat. Customer session bean, get customers. If we run this particular servlet, we should see the same result as before. But let's check anyway. Run the application. Okay, we get the same result. Our session bean is working, our JPA is working. Let's move now into our final layer, the PrimeFaces visual GUI on top of this application. What we want to do is, inside of our PrimeFaces file, inside of the facelets file, we want to call our session bean, and via the session bean call the underlying data and display it inside of this application. We start by going back into NetBeans IDE, where we see we have our PrimeFaces page with our message welcome to PrimeFaces. And in this part of the page, in the center part of the page, we would like to display more than just this text. In fact, we would like to display our list of customers here. To do this, there are many components we could use, also from PrimeFaces. However, we'll keep it simple to get started and use a JSF data table. This is a standard facelets component, enabling you to use expression language to access the underlying session bean. Now, right now, if we use code completion in here, you see that we can't access our session bean. That is because the session bean hasn't been set up to be injected into the view layer yet. That is possible since Java EE 6 via the CDI specification, context and dependency injection, simply by adding an annotation named. Now we are specifying that the session bean can be injected into the view layer, which means we are bringing the transaction layer into the higher level of the application, into the view layer, which also requires a beans.xml file, which has automatically been created by NetBeans IDE, where we can set rules and constraints on the named session beans that we have defined. Now that we've done that, we can use code completion, control space, and we see customer session bean, and we can use a dot, and then using the expression language, refer to the get customers method. So customer session bean.customers actually, when you hyperlink back into the session bean, means get customers, which in turn uses the entity manager to get to the lower layers to get into the data. We have the item as a variable, which we can now begin using. So here I type column, and I can now use the expression language to get into the columns via the item variable, item.city, for example. And when I save and refresh the browser, I see the list of cities that are provided from the database for each of the customers that are found in the customers table. In addition to city, let's also add something else, maybe the customer's name. Again, save the file, which redeploys the application, refresh the browser, and there is our data. We can make this look slightly better by adding some size tags. So this could be H3, for example. This H3. Save the page, refresh the browser, and we are already getting a better looking application. Some other details that could be useful would be the email, save, refresh the browser, and so on. As you can see, it's very easy to get started, to use PrimeFaces together with Maven in NetBeans IDE. All the tools are included, and getting up and started with a simple application like this, pulling in real data from the database, doesn't take much work. Steps to follow after this could include to generate not only the entity classes from the database, but also the JSF pages from the entity classes. When you do that, you would get a complete CRUD application that doesn't only view the data, but also lets you change, update, delete the data that relates to the columns in the database that you're displaying in the application. And with that, I'll leave you and wish you all the best with PrimeFaces, Maven, NetBeans, and Java EE 6 in general.